Hi, this is Chris Walker, and I almost didn't make this video because honestly, the TV industry makes it exhausting to talk about prices this time of year. But I was walking through Costco a couple days ago, and I saw a guy literally loading a brand new full-price 2026 OLED into his cart while parked right next to a pallet of last year's models that were marked down by, no joke, $1,500. I actually wanted to physically stop him because here's the reality the big brands are desperately hoping you ignore this month. The generational leap from last year's flagship TVs to the ones hitting shelves right now, it's basically an illusion. They slapped a new AI upscaling sticker on the box, tweaked the home screen to show you more ads, and reset the price tag back to $3,000. If you are buying a TV right now and you ignore the clearance cycle we are currently in, you are just setting your money on fire for a spec sheet you can't even see with the naked eye. Before we get into the exact models that are actually worth your cash right now, and the clearance traps with hidden panel defects you need to actively avoid, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and like the video. It helps me buy these sets at retail so I don't ever owe these manufacturers any favors, and I can just tell you the actual unfiltered truth. Okay, let's look at what's actually happening out there. It's completely wild to me how we've been conditioned to shop for electronics. The whole consumer tech industry is basically built on this engineered FOMO, fear of missing out. Every single spring, the big brands roll out their new lineup. They invite reviewers to these incredibly tightly controlled hotel suites in Vegas or New York. They turn all the lights off and they show us a side-by-side comparison where the new 2026 model looks 10% brighter than the old one. And they say, look at the AI upscaling, look at the micro contrast, and then they slap a $3,000 price tag on it. But what they don't show you is what happens to the millions of TVs they manufactured last year that didn't sell by Super Bowl Sunday.
Let's talk about the LG C4. If you walk into a store right now, the 65-inch version of this TV is sitting in the clearance aisle or open box section for anywhere between $1,200 and $1,500. Now, the brand new 2026 equivalent, let's call it the C-Series replacement, is going to run you at least $2,500, maybe closer to $3,000 after tax. So you have to ask yourself, what exactly are you getting for that extra $1,500? Because I can tell you right now, it isn't physics. Actually, wait, let me explain that better. Let's talk about the actual physics of this panel. The C4 uses an OLED panel, organic light emitting diode. Every single one of the 8.3 million pixels on this screen produces its own light and its own color. When a scene calls for black, like the letterbox bars at the top and bottom of a movie or the night sky in a Batman film, those specific pixels just turn off. They draw zero power. They emit zero light. That gives you an infinite contrast ratio. Now, the brands want you to focus on the one thing OLEDs historically struggle with: brightness. The marketing material for the new 2026 models will scream about pushing 2,000 nits or 3,000 nits of peak brightness. But here's the hidden truth they bury in the fine print. That measurement is taken on a 2% window. Think about what that means in the real world. A 2% window is a flashlight shining down a dark hallway or a single street lamp in a dark alley. Yes, that one tiny spot on the screen will sear your retinas. But what happens when you switch over to watch a hockey game or a ski documentary? Suddenly, the whole screen is white. This is where the physical reality of the technology kicks in. An OLED panel cannot run the entire screen at maximum brightness. If it did, the power supply would melt and the organic compounds inside the pixels would literally cook themselves to death, leaving permanent burn-in within a week. So LG uses software called an auto brightness limiter, or ABL. When the TV detects a full-screen bright image, it violently throttles the power. Suddenly, that blindingly bright TV drops down to maybe 200 or 250 nits. The snow in that ski documentary doesn't look crisp white anymore. It looks like a dull, slightly depressing gray.
The C4 does this. The new 2026 models do this. It is a limitation of the chemistry, not the processor. You are paying a $1,500 premium for a new TV that is still going to aggressively dim the picture the second you try to watch a daytime football game in a sunlit living room.
So if the visual difference in a normal US living room is basically imperceptible, why is the C4 the ultimate sweet spot right now? It comes down to structural hardware. I've tested dozens of TVs over the last few years, and one of the most infuriating things manufacturers do to save literally pennies on the assembly line is cheap out on the motherboard. You'll buy a $2,000 Sony or a high-end Hisense. You get it home, you look at the back, and you realize only 2 of the HDMI ports are HDMI 2.1. If you aren't a massive gamer, I didn't think this would matter, but it does. Here's what I mean. Let's say you buy a Sonos Arc or any modern Dolby Atmos soundbar. That soundbar has to plug into the specific HDMI port labeled eARC, so the TV can send the high-quality audio out. Well, on most TVs, that eARC port is also one of your 2 precious HDMI 2.1 ports, so now you only have 1 high-speed port left. If you own a PlayStation 5 and an Xbox Series X, or a PlayStation 5 and a gaming PC, you are screwed. Every time you want to switch consoles to get 4K at 120 frames per second, you are getting up off the couch, reaching behind the TV, and physically swapping cables like it's 2005. The LG C4 doesn't play that game. All 4 of its ports are full bandwidth, 48 gigabit per second HDMI 2.1. You plug in your soundbar, you plug in your PS5, you plug in your Apple TV, and you never have to think about it again. It just works. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend this TV is flawless, because the moment you actually turn it on and try to find a movie, you hit the biggest UI friction point of modern LG ownership: WebOS. I noticed something strange happening about 3 years ago with LG's software. It went from this clean, minimalist row of apps at the bottom of the screen to this bloated full-screen billboard. The processor inside the C4 is incredibly fast at handling image data. It does a phenomenal job taking a heavily compressed, low bitrate 1080p feed from YouTube TV and cleaning up the blocky artifacts so a basketball game actually looks decent. But ask that same processor to navigate the home screen, it's a laggy mess. You'll turn the TV on, and before you can even click on Netflix, you are forced to wait while the TV downloads and displays a massive banner ad for a car you aren't going to buy or a terrible straight-to-streaming movie. And the magic remote? Look, some people love the little Nintendo Wii-style cursor on the screen. Personally, I find it infuriating. When you're trying to quickly pause a movie in the dark, the motion sensor kicks in, a giant pink teardrop appears on your screen, and you end up clicking the wrong thing. It's an annoyance, but is it a $1,500 annoyance? Absolutely not, because you can completely bypass all of that garbage by just spending $130 on an Apple TV 4K, plugging it into one of those 4 glorious HDMI ports, and never connecting the actual LG TV to the internet at all. So the C4 is the utility knife. It does everything right for the price. But, and this is a massive but, if you care deeply about color volume, if you're the kind of person who notices when a red Ferrari in a movie looks a little bit orange, or you play a lot of hyper-colorful HDR video games, the C4 actually loses this fight. Because while LG was coasting on their traditional OLED tech, Samsung was quietly engineering something that completely changed the math for this price bracket. Before we dive into the Samsung S90D and why the clearance pricing on this specific TV completely breaks the traditional rules of buying an OLED, I want to know where you guys are at right now. Drop a comment below and tell me what is the oldest piece of tech in your living room that you refuse to replace, and what review do you want to see me tear down next? I read literally every single comment because that's where the real-world data is. All right. Let's talk about quantum dots. If that one feels like overkill, this next one is where the math actually starts to make sense for the enthusiasts. If that one feels like overkill, this next one is where the math actually starts to make sense for the enthusiasts. We need to talk about Samsung's S90D and why the clearance pricing on this specific TV completely breaks the traditional rules of buying an OLED. For the longest time, LG had an absolute monopoly on making these panels. Even if you bought a Sony OLED or a Vizio OLED, you were secretly just buying an LG panel with someone else's plastic wrapped around it. They all used a technology called WOLED. That stands for white OLED. Here is exactly how that works and why it matters to your wallet. To make a television bright enough to fight the glare in a typical US living room, you need to push a lot of power into the organic pixels. But if you push too much power into red, green, and blue pixels, they overheat, they degrade, and they permanently burn in. So LG came up with a massive compromise. They added a fourth subpixel to the cluster, a white one. When a scene in a movie gets incredibly bright, let's say you're watching Mad Max and there's a massive fiery explosion, or you're playing Cyberpunk 2077 and you're staring at a neon billboard, the TV physically cannot push the colored pixels hard enough to make it punchy. So the software cheats. It violently fires that white subpixel to boost the overall brightness. But think about what happens when you mix pure white paint into a bucket of pure red paint. It doesn't get brighter red, it turns pink. It washes out. The color loses its density. On an LG C4, in the brightest, most spectacular HDR moments, the colors actually lose their saturation because that white pixel is completely taking over. I didn't think this would matter to the average person until I put a Samsung S90D right next to it. Samsung looked at LG's monopoly and decided to brute force a completely different physics engine. They created QD-OLED, quantum dot OLED. There is no white subpixel on the S90D, none. The TV uses pure blue OLED material as the backlight, and it shines that blue light through a microscopic layer of quantum dots to create pure red and pure green. Because it doesn't rely on a white subpixel to cheat its brightness, when an explosion happens on the S90D, it is violently, intensely orange and red. The color volume on this TV, especially in the highlights, makes the LG C4 look almost muted by comparison.
And right now, because of the clearance cycle, you can find 65-inch S90Ds stacked up at Best Buy or Sam's Club for right around the same $1,500 mark as the C4. It feels like an absolute steal. You are getting superior second-generation panel tech for mid-tier money. But there is always a trap. And Samsung's trap is entirely self-inflicted. If you buy the S90D, you have to accept 3 massive real-world compromises that the spec sheet conveniently ignores. First, the thermals and the long-term wear. Pushing pure colors to extreme brightness without a white subpixel generates heat, and heat is the natural enemy of an organic light-emitting diode. If you look at the independent long-term stress tests from places like Arding's, QD-OLEDs have historically shown a slightly higher susceptibility to permanent image retention, burn-in, if you abuse them. If you are the kind of person who leaves CNN or ESPN running for 8 hours a day every single day with those bright red static ticker bars at the bottom of the screen, do not buy this TV. You will literally cook the red subpixels, and by year 3, you will have a ghost image of the ESPN logo permanently scarred into your screen. The S90D is an enthusiast panel. It's meant for diverse full-screen content, movies, prestige TV, mixed gaming, not static cable news. Second, and this one makes me irrationally angry, Samsung flat out refuses to support Dolby Vision. Dolby Vision is the gold standard for high dynamic range video. It uses dynamic metadata to tell your TV exactly how bright or dark every single frame of a movie should be, tailored exactly to the physical limitations of your specific panel. Netflix uses it, Apple TV Plus uses it, Disney Plus uses it. It's everywhere. But Samsung refuses to pay the licensing fee to Dolby. They stubbornly push their own competing open source format called HDR10+. The problem is, barely anybody uses HDR10+ outside of Amazon Prime Video.
And finally, the third compromise of the S90D, Tizen OS. Samsung's operating system is a disaster. It genuinely feels like they let the marketing department design the user interface instead of software engineers. It takes way too many clicks just to change an input or tweak a basic brightness setting. The menus are sluggish, they are packed with sponsored content you can't delete, and it constantly tries to force you into their proprietary Samsung TV Plus free channel app when you just want to play your Xbox. Again, an Apple TV 4K solves this entirely, but it's a hidden tax you need to factor into the clearance price. Actually, let me back up a second, because there is a group of buyers out there who don't care about gaming. They don't care about extreme peak brightness. They just want their movies to look like actual cinema, and they want their terrible compressed cable TV feed to stop looking like a pixelated mess. If you just want the TV to process an image perfectly without you ever having to touch a calibration slider, you don't buy the LG and you don't buy the Samsung. You buy the Bravia 8. Right now, you can find the Bravia 8 sitting in that same clearance window, but you are going to pay a premium. Even heavily discounted, a 65-inch Bravia 8 is going to run you closer to $1,800 or $2,000. That is the infamous Sony tax. You are paying a premium for a television that actually uses a slightly dimmer WOLED panel than the LG C4. So why the hell would anyone do that? Because of the silicon. Sony's XR processor is basically black magic. Here's a reality that nobody talks about in the Best Buy showroom. They always play these pristine, uncompressed 4K demo loops of honey dripping off a spoon or a lizard crawling on a bright green leaf. Everything looks perfect. But when you get the TV home, you're probably going to watch Thursday Night Football on Amazon Prime or a highly compressed 1080p feed from your local cable box. When you feed a garbage, low bitrate signal to an LG or a Samsung, they will try to sharpen it, but they often leave massive, blocky artifacts in the dark areas of the screen. You'll see horizontal banding in the sky. The image breaks down. When you feed that same garbage signal to a Sony Bravia 8, the XR processor analyzes the frame, understands what it's looking at, and smooths out the gradients. It applies temporal dithering. It removes the macro blocking. It takes a terrible cable TV feed and actively reconstructs it so it looks incredibly clean. And their motion handling? Nobody touches Sony. Movies are shot at 24 frames per second. The physical refresh rate of an OLED is 120 Hertz. Mathematically, 24 goes into 120 perfectly 5 times. But OLED pixels transition so instantaneously, we are talking less than a millisecond, that 24-frame panning shots can actually look like a strobe light to the human eye. It's called OLED stutter. To fix this, LG and Samsung use motion interpolation. They guess what the frames in between should look like. But if you turn that setting up even slightly too high, the movie suddenly looks like a cheap daytime soap opera. It completely ruins the director's intent. Sony has figured out an algorithm that softens the stutter without introducing the soap opera effect. It just looks like actual cinema. But I warned you about the Sony tax, and it's not just the price tag. I noticed something a couple years ago with Sony that they still refuse to fix even on their premium models. If you look at the back of the Bravia 8, they only give you 2 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports. And just like we talked about earlier, one of them is your eARC port for your soundbar. If you are dropping $2,000 on a clearance TV in 2026 and the manufacturer only gives you one usable high-speed port for your gaming consoles, it feels like a slap in the face. It's a blatant cost-cutting measure on a TV that markets itself as premium. If you are a massive gamer, the Sony is instantly disqualified. So, we have the C4 as the versatile, safe bet workhorse. We have the S90D as the vibrant QD-OLED muscle car with terrible menus. And we have the Bravia 8 as the overpriced, underported cinema purist's dream. But what if you're sitting there thinking, Chris, I don't care about motion handling algorithms and I don't care about color volume. I just want an OLED and I want it to be as cheap as physically possible without being garbage. You're probably looking at the LG B4. And I am begging you, be incredibly careful with this exact model. You are probably looking at the LG B4, and I am begging you, be incredibly careful with this exact model, because on paper, it looks like the ultimate hack. It's an OLED, it has perfect blacks, and right now, in this clearance window, you can sometimes find the 55-inch or even the 65-inch version sitting on a pallet for under $1,000. For a lot of people, breaking that sub-$1,000 psychological barrier for an OLED feels like the holy grail. But I need you to understand exactly what LG physically stripped out of this TV to hit that price point, because it's not just marketing. First, the panel itself is fundamentally dimmer. The B4 does not use the EVO panel technology found in the C4. It doesn't have the same heat dissipation, which means LG's software has to be incredibly aggressive with the auto brightness limiter to prevent the TV from literally burning itself out. If you put this TV in a dark basement or a dedicated blackout home theater, it looks phenomenal. But if you put it in a normal American living room with sliding glass doors and afternoon sun, you aren't going to see the movie. You are just going to see a perfect 4K reflection of your own face staring back at you. Second, they downgraded the brain of the TV. The C4 uses their higher-end Alpha 9 or Alpha 11 silicon depending on the exact region and size. The B4 drops down to a slower, cheaper processor. I actually didn't expect this part to matter as much as it did, but when you watch fast-panning sports like hockey or Formula 1 on the B4, the motion interpolation just cannot keep up with the math. You get these weird micro-stutters around fast-moving objects. It's like the TV is constantly dropping a single frame every 3 seconds. If you're sensitive to that kind of jitter, it will drive you absolutely insane. So this brings us to the actual decision matrix. We have looking at the physical reality of these panels, the thermal limitations, the software bloat, and the massive clearance discounts currently sitting in retail stores. Let's group these by who they are actually for, because buying the best TV is a myth. You have to buy the right TV for your specific living room. If you are building a mixed-use living room, you watch YouTube, your kids play Nintendo Switch, you watch Netflix on the weekends, and you just want a premium, zero-headache experience that handles everything well, you buy the LG C4. It is the undisputed Swiss Army knife of this generation. You get 4 full-bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, you get a panel bright enough to survive moderate daylight, and at the current clearance price of around $1,200 to $1,500, the math is unbeatable. Just do yourself a favor, never connect it to your Wi-Fi. Buy a dedicated streaming box, bypass LG's laggy, ad-filled WebOS entirely, and let the TV just act as a pure, beautiful monitor. Now, wait, let me revise that slightly. If you are a hardcore gamer, or you exclusively watch high bitrate 4K Blu-rays in a light-controlled room, and you want colors that actually punch you in the chest, you pivot to the Samsung S90. The quantum dot technology on that panel is objectively superior for color volume. When you play a game like Cyberpunk or Spider-Man 2, the neon lights and the vibrant reds and greens are going to look significantly better than they do on the LG. But you are actively choosing to sacrifice Dolby Vision, and you are actively accepting that Samsung's Tizen operating system is going to fight you every step of the way. If you can live with that trade-off, the S90 is the highest performing panel you can get for the money right now. And finally, if you are the cinematic purist, if you still watch a lot of cable TV or you stream highly compressed live sports, and you absolutely refuse to tolerate motion judder or blocky artifacts in the dark areas of your screen, you swallow your pride, you pay the Sony tax, and you buy the Bravia 8. You're getting an inferior port layout and you're paying more money, but Sony's image processing silicon is basically magic. Here's the part the consumer tech industry absolutely hates me saying out loud. That is the hidden truth of this entire market. These companies rely on you chasing the absolute bleeding edge. They want you to look at a 2026 spec sheet, see a 10% increase in peak brightness on a 2% window, and convince yourself that it's worth spending an extra $1,500. It's not. It is a mathematical illusion designed to empty your wallet. The generational upgrades have completely stagnated. A 2024 LG LG C4 or a Samsung S90D is going to give you 95% of the exact same visual experience as the brand new models they're trying to shove down your throat right now. The only difference is that the older models are currently sitting in a warehouse taking up space, and the retailers are bleeding money trying to get rid of them. Take advantage of their panic. But you have to be careful because big box retailers like Costco and Sam's Club often get slightly different specific model numbers, like an LG C4 AUA instead of the standard PUA, where they might strip out a WISA speaker certification or slightly alter the bezel to prevent you from price matching. Usually the panel is identical, but you need to know exactly what revision you are putting in your cart. To make this completely frictionless, I have put links down in the description to the exact vetted models we talked about today. These are the safe versions. No weird warehouse submodels, no stripped out ports. If you use those links, it does help support this channel so I can keep buying these sets and tearing them apart. But more importantly, it ensures you aren't accidentally buying a downgraded revision. Grab the clearance deal, put the $1,500 you just saved back into your bank account, and for the love of God, stop watching CNN with the static ticker for 8 hours a day on an OLED. I'm Chris Walker. I'll see you in the next one.